It's one of the last militarily neutral countries in Europe, an island version of Switzerland perched on the edges of the Atlantic, far from any hostile neighbours. For its entire time as an independent state, Ireland has remained outside of the network of military alliances stretching from Europe to North America. It's not a member of NATO, nor did it fight with the Allies in World War II. And while Irish troops have been sent on deployments, the country maintains a triple log, requiring assent from the government, the Dáil, and the UN to send more than 12 soldiers abroad. According to a public polling, it's a system most Irish are proud of, an assent that allows Dublin to punch above its weight in diplomatic circles. Yet all that could soon change. As you watch this, a consultative forum is being held across Ireland, one in which the question of neutrality is being weighed carefully. One which might, possibly, even nudge the Emerald Isle toward NATO. In today's episode, we're examining the modern challenges and issues facing Ireland's security establishment and asking whether joining NATO could really be the answer. For observers of Irish defence policy, it was a true bombshell, a rhetorical blast that echoed across the island. In mid-May of 2023, Foreign Minister Michael Martin, who also heads the defence brief, stood before the Dáil Parliament and confirmed an upcoming debate on the future of Ireland's military neutrality. To quote, "We will discuss what our current policy of military neutrality means, whether it is fit for purpose in the current global security environment, and whether we need to define more clearly what we do and do not mean by military neutrality." Perhaps most shockingly of all, Martin even hinted that the outcome could raise the possibility of one day joining NATO. The reaction that followed was swift and it was blunt. At a conference in Dublin, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar firmly declared that Ireland would not be joining NATO. President Michael D. Higgins, meanwhile, complained that Dublin was, quote, playing with fire. On the news, interviewees were borderline perplexed. As the chairman of the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, Roger Cole, pointed out to RTE, Ireland is a small country surrounded by countries that have no intention of invading us, and we have no intention of invading them. All of which naturally raises the question, well, why now? Why did Michael Martin choose this moment to call a consultative forum on an issue his own Taoiseach had dismissed? For that, you can thank Vladimir Putin. Like most of Europe, Ireland was shocked by the Kremlin's full-blown invasion of Ukraine, an invasion that convinced other non-aligned countries like Finland and Sweden to seek NATO protection. But while Helsinki and Stockholm both applied to join the alliance within 2 months of war breaking out, Ireland has yet to do so. So far from Russia, Dublin is seen as an unlikely target for Putin's aggression, although the nation has taken in Ukrainian refugees and joined EU sanctions against Moscow.
Further sanctions.
Comprehensive and severe sanctions on Russia.
It's also trying to maintain its military neutrality. But that doesn't mean the Ukraine war hasn't dragged the issue of defense into the public conversation. Polls in the 16 months since fighting began have shown a swing towards NATO. Never enough to reach a majority, but a larger minority than has ever been seen before. Before the invasion, support for joining NATO was kicking at around a third of voters. In the immediate aftermath, this spiked to 48%, a number repeated in polls in both May and August of 2022. Now, these numbers are soft and seem to depend on how you ask the question. For example, the Irish Times recently ran a headline on Twitter claiming 56% of people surveyed think Ireland should join NATO. An impressive figure until you realise that the same survey also reported that 61% of voters wanted Ireland to maintain its current model of military neutrality, something that would obviously be impossible to do in NATO. Nonetheless, the invasion kicked off enough of a debate that Martin felt comfortable calling the Consultative Forum. Running from June the 22nd to June the 29th of this year, the forum features 1,000 citizens along with academics and military personnel, as well as guest speakers from neutral countries like Switzerland and formerly neutral countries like Finland. To be clear, this is a different beast from the citizens' assemblies that Ireland has previously called for discussing social issues like abortion, a fact that has brought a whole pile of criticism down on Martin's head, as have the invited speakers. T.D. McBarry called the list a pro-NATO jamboree. T.D. Richard Boyd went even further, accusing the government of trying to drag Ireland into NATO by stealth. Clearly, this is an issue that elicits a lot of strong feelings in Irish society. Feelings that I, as an outsider, am not really in a position to judge. Yet, in a way, the NATO question is really only a fraction of what the forum will be discussing. Below the alarmist headlines lurks a far more difficult issue, one Irish military experts have quietly acknowledged for some time. The issue of how to ensure Ireland has the capacity to defend herself in an increasingly hostile world. Whatever answer the Consultative Forum returns with could have implications for Dublin's place in the world for decades to come. Considering how central it is to Ireland's identity, it might be surprising to learn that there's nothing in the nation's constitution about neutrality. Instead, Dublin has its so-called triple lock, which requires not just approval of the Irish government and the Dáil, but also a UN mandate to deploy over a dozen troops abroad. Obviously, that's a high bar to clear, but it's not an impossible one. Over the decades, Irish defence forces have taken part in UN peacekeeping missions in places like Cyprus and Lebanon. So, if the concept of Irish neutrality isn't constitutionally enshrined, you might be wondering, well, where does it come from? The answer lies in a combination of history and diplomatic necessity. The history part is easy enough. Ireland only threw off Britain's tea-stained shackles to become independent in the early 1920s. Even then, London continued to control vital ports. It was only with the 1938 end of the treaty ports that Dublin could truly start setting its own defence policy. And surprise, surprise, that policy was rooted in its own past as a colonial possession. That meant both an anti-imperialist streak and a desire to never again be under Britain's boot. When World War II broke out just a year later, Taoiseach Eamon de Valera refused London's desperate entreaties to join the Allies. Famously, he even visited the German embassy in 1945 to offer official condolences over Adolf Hitler's death. What seems like a rock-solid commitment to neutrality today was, in reality, far more nuanced. For one thing, de Valera wasn't as even-handed as he wanted the Germans to think. Secretly, he allowed Britain to install radar stations in Ireland and turned a blind eye to the RAF crossing Irish airspace. For another, an officially neutral pose didn't mean no Irish served in World War II. 70,000 volunteers fought on the Allied side. Still, truly neutral or not, Dublin's stance in World War II set the pattern for the next 8 decades. When NATO first formed in the early Cold War, there was talk of Ireland joining, but rather than join a club that included its old imperial overlord, Dublin elected for non-aligned status. By the 1950s, the policy was paying dividends. Writing in thejournal.ie, retired Irish Army officer Tom Clonan has talked about how military neutrality gave Ireland an opening in international relations that wouldn't have existed otherwise. To quote him, "Despite our small size, Ireland has functioned as a diplomatic superpower in the cause of peace, precisely because of our militarily neutral status." End quote. It's a status that's visible today just by looking at the structure of the Irish defence establishment. As War on the Rocks put it in a 2023 article, Ireland doesn't have a national security strategy, a functioning National Security Council, or a national security agency. The same applies to defence. Put simply, the security and defence architecture widely used in the European Union and transatlantic space does not exist in Ireland. End quote. Even among Europe's non-aligned states, this is highly unusual. As we covered in our video on their joining NATO, both Finland and Sweden have long maintained robust militaries. Switzerland famously has a nationwide armed militia on standby. Yet this doesn't mean that Ireland stands completely outside Euro-Atlantic defence structures. Back in 1999, the Emerald Isle joined NATO's Partnership for Peace plan. As a member of the EU, it's also committed to a mutual defence treaty with the rest of the bloc, although not one that would override the triple lock. More significantly, Dublin has recently begun to get deeply involved in the EU's PESCO initiative. A way to build interoperability among European armies, PESCO is somewhere between a grand swap shop for ideas, a training program, and an actual military partnership. While the main focus is to make sure everyone in Europe is using the same kit and studying the same techniques, joining also requires a government to make 20 commitments on things like R&D and defence spending. According to RTE, before the Ukraine war, Ireland was involved in only 2 PESCO projects, one as a participant and one as an observer. Today, though, that number stands at 23, nearly a third of all PESCO initiatives. All things considered then, Ireland already seems to be converging with Western allies. Certainly far more than it was 30 or even 5 years ago. But maybe not close enough for those allies to take comfort. Because, as we're about to see, there's another reason Ireland joining NATO is becoming an increasingly hot topic, one driven less by considerations in Dublin and more by anxieties in Washington and Brussels. The fear that when it comes to European defence, Ireland may be the weakest link of all. A fundamental issue with being neutral is that you're only truly neutral if everyone also agrees that you are. And Russia has recently been testing the limits of Irish neutrality. There was the 2021 ransomware attack on Ireland's health service, for example, which was linked to a Russian hacker group and caused untold damage. Far more pressing for other nations, though, have been Russian incursions into Ireland's waters. In February 2022, just days before Putin began his assault on Ukraine, the Russian Navy announced live-fire exercises off of Ireland's southwest coast, well within Dublin's exclusive economic zone. While the Irish government successfully protested the exercises, the relief was short-lived. That summer, 3 Russian warships entered Irish waters and were tracked making strange movements. As recently as May 2023, 4 more were observed in the same rough area, also acting weirdly. For experts in Ireland, the EU, and America, these incursions have triggered serious alarm bells. Not because they're designed to be menacing, although they're also that, but because of where they've taken place. Irish waters, you see, just happen to be home to one of the greatest concentrations of data cables in the world. According to RTE, our oceans are crisscrossed by something in the region of 550 data cables covering a total of 1.4 million kilometers. Faster than satellites and with wider bandwidth, these cables are the highways along which 99% of Earth's internet traffic zooms. That means flame wars and kinky fanfiction, but also trillions of dollars in financial transactions. Among the most important concentrations are the cables connecting Europe to North America. Nearly 3/4 pass through Irish waters, one of the main reasons Ireland has been able to reinvent itself as a giant data hub for corporations like Microsoft. In total, 9 out of the world's top 10 tech and communication companies base some of their operations in Ireland. This boosts the Irish economy, while also allowing these mostly US-based brands to instantaneously transmit information back to America. The problem? All it takes is for one malign actor to cut or destroy these cables, and we'll have chaos on both sides of the Atlantic. Since 2014, Russia has been active near many concentrations of these cables. They're seemingly mapping them on both sides of the ocean. This has coincided with an increasing ability on Moscow's part to carry out deep-sea sabotage missions. In 2014, cables were severed linking Crimea to mainland Ukraine. For Europe and America, this is deeply worrying. The destruction of these cables could cause not only massive disruption to communications, but also economic damage. There could be a swell of public unrest or even panic. Scores of countries would be affected. Unfortunately, there's not much evidence Ireland can defend this vital infrastructure on its own. Despite having a vast maritime area, Dublin commands a mere 6 patrol vessels, none of which are useful for combating deep-sea sabotage. As the 2020 Defence Forces Review bleakly spelled out, the Irish Naval Service has no anti-submarine capability, and its ability to deter or even detect such maritime intelligence gathering is exceptionally limited. And it's here that we come to the root of the problem facing Ireland in all military domains. Unlike most militarily neutral countries, from Singapore to Switzerland, Ireland isn't a military powerhouse. It doesn't field top-of-the-range kit. It doesn't have a massive reserve force ready to fight. It doesn't spend huge sums of money to keep its citizens safe. And that means the island nation could be vulnerable in ways most people would never expect. In March of 2023, War on the Rocks published a deep dive into the Irish military structural problems. Written by 2 Irishmen with inside knowledge of the nation's defence services, Dr. Patrick Barry and Dr. David Murphy, the piece was nothing if not a literal call to arms. A blaring siren warning Dublin of the dangers of continued underinvestment. Because, make no mistake, the figures as they stand today aren't just dire, they're terrifying. According to Barry and Murphy, the Irish Defence Forces ended 2022 with a total of just 7,987 personnel, 3,000 fewer than the recommended total. In the Reserve Defence Forces, the numbers were even worse. From an original size of 4,069, they had shrunk to just 819 members. As the writers grimly noted, on their current trajectory, they could cease to exist in 3 years. Dig deeper, and the picture gets even worse. The Irish military has a huge retention problem, with 3/4 of junior officers who joined after 2013 planning to quit the forces early, part of a wave of talent flowing out to the private sector. 2021, for example, saw 591 personnel leave against just 300 new recruits. Nor are these cherry-picked numbers. The Irish Examiner has reported that, quote, across the forces, there are not enough bomb disposal experts, medics, communications experts, technicians, marine engineers, and engine room artificers who are vital for keeping ships at sea. Speaking of the Navy, their personnel numbers have been in decline since 2015, to the extent that otherwise functional vessels are being left in port simply because they don't have enough crew members. The reasons for all of this aren't that hard to fathom. At just 0.2% of GDP, the equivalent of 1.1 billion euros, Ireland's defence budget is the lowest in the entire EU, and that lack of funding is helping to drive recruits away. War on the Rocks reports that soldiers' pay is falling far behind inflation, while accommodation is generally substandard. The Irish Examiner, meanwhile, has highlighted how low the new pensions introduced in 2013 are, low enough that many junior officers will have to leave at some point or face old age poverty. The result has been staffing shortages across all domains, expertise lost to the private sector, giant holes appearing in the nation's security. To illustrate, let's briefly focus on airspace. Like with the undersea cables, Ireland's geographic position on the edge of Europe gives it prominent place in aviation. 90% of all transatlantic flights cross through Irish airspace. But a lack of enough aircraft, air defences and radar means Dublin cannot patrol its own skies. In an embarrassing twist, Ireland instead relies on the British RAF to protect its airspace. UK pilots have wound up being the ones who escort out Russian fighter jets that enter Irish skies. As the Journal.ie noted with exasperation, Ireland is the only country in the EU with no primary radar or meaningful air capabilities by way of aircraft or air defences. And to add to this sad list, we can also throw in cyber. While non-aligned Sweden recognized early on that cyber was becoming an important military domain and now fields perhaps Europe's most formidable set of capabilities in this area, Ireland has neglected cyber as badly as everything else. The results? A country that stores over 30% of the EU's data while also being unusually vulnerable to cyber attacks. Now we could go on. We'll leave it to Patrick Borey and David Murphy to sum up the current state of Irish defence with a quote. Ireland now only has rudimentary land, air and naval forces, which lack the personnel and key equipment to fulfill any national defence scenario. All this then is why NATO membership is being floated as a potential plan. With the alliance's collective defence policy enshrined in Article 5, Ireland could step back and let other nations like France or the UK defend its weak points. Let other members of the alliance send out ships and submarines to guard transatlantic cables. Yet it's worth pointing out that joining NATO isn't the only way for Dublin to shore up its defences. If Ireland really wants to maintain its neutrality, then there's another way to discourage rogue states like Russia from attacking its infrastructure. A defence spending bonanza that would turn the Emerald Isle into a shiny green porcupine. For any Irish viewers who enjoy a bit of masochism, there can be few better ways to get your kicks than reading the 2022 Independent Commission on the Defence Forces report. It's from this document that knowledge of many of the problems outlined earlier comes. So bad were its conclusions that the then Foreign Minister, Simon Carvany, declared it showed the Defence Forces, quote, cannot protect Ireland from potential attack. But while it was certainly self-flagellating, the report wasn't all pain and no gain. In the conclusion, the authors outlined 3 possible new tiers of defence funding, tiers it termed levels of ambition. The first level was basically the equivalent of trying to plug a hole in a leaky boat before everybody drowns, an injection of cash that would stop the downward slide. The second level was a bit more ambitious, involving new capabilities in radar, cyber, and airlift, plus upgraded naval capacity, the equivalent of towing the leaky boat back to port for a total refit. The third level, meanwhile, was like ditching the broken boat altogether and buying a mega yacht. This level envisioned an Ireland with full spectrum defence capabilities, a neutral country so highly armed that no one would ever dare fuck with its neutrality again. Now, each came with obvious trade-offs and benefits. Level 1, for example, would be as cheap as a crate of Pabst Blue Ribbon, but also offer Dublin about the same level of protection. Level 3, by contrast, would leave Ireland more than capable of defending its own waters, but would require the defence budget to be tripled to slightly over €3 billion a year. All of which may be why the Irish government went for the Goldilocks option, neither too cheap nor too expensive. Chosen in the summer of 2022, Level of Ambition 2 envisages increasing defence spending to €1.5 billion a year by 2028, the biggest boost in Irish history. According to the BBC, this will lead to 2,000 new recruits in defence roles, as well as the installation of military-grade radar. More importantly, from the perspective of Europe and America, it will lead to a big upgrade in naval capability. Right now, the Irish Naval Service operates 4 P-60 class ships plus 2 inshore patrol vessels recently purchased from New Zealand. An additional P-50 ship is being refitted, while another is held in reserve. A level of Ambition 2 spending should boost this to a bare minimum of 9 ships outfitted with modern capabilities such as, to quote, enhanced air, surface, and subsurface search capabilities supported by appropriate modern technology, including ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and unmanned shipborne RPAS, remotely piloted aircraft system, providing tactical airborne capabilities. If this is achieved, the naval service will be capable of monitoring undersea cables without help from allies. Already, all 4 P-60 vessels are being retrofitted with multi-beam echo sounders to facilitate this. Nor will it be just on the seas that Irish defence abilities increase. It'll be in the skies above them too. RTE reports that the Air Corps Maritime Patrol Squadron currently has 2 CASA 235s to surveil the whole of Ireland's waters. The plan sees these being replaced this year with newer C-295 aircraft, which will come equipped with, and here I'm just going to go ahead and quote it again, multiple LiDAR shallow subsurface detection systems combining airborne topography, bathymetry surveying, and high-resolution imaging. At the same time, the government has recommended much deeper cooperation with EU-led PESCO projects, especially those revolving around maritime surveillance. As we speak, Dublin is already involved in 3 such initiatives. There's also talk about engaging with a proposed new NATO branch known as the Critical Undersea Infrastructure Coordination Cell, a way to hopefully gain much-needed NATO expertise around deep-sea defence without compromising Irish neutrality. In short, things are moving. The Irish defence establishment is transforming, hoping to meet the challenges of a world that seems to be slipping back into an era of great power competition. If all goes ahead, it's going to be a spectacular change. The only trouble is that not everyone is sure it's going to be enough, not against a Russia determined to commit deep-sea sabotage. And it's here that we return to the conundrum at the heart of the Consultative Forum: how to ensure Ireland has the capacity to defend herself in an increasingly hostile world. Now, obviously, I'm not Irish, it's not up to me to tell Dublin how to run its defence policy, and not only because of the attendant seismic risks that would come from Eamon de Valera spinning in his grave. But having researched this video, it's clear that something needs to be done, that carrying on as before would be a great disservice to not just Ireland's American and European allies, but to the Irish people themselves. Whether that something comes in the form of NATO membership or a defence spending boost beyond even level 2 of ambition is something the Consultative Forum will have to decide. Whatever their recommendations though, this much is clear. Our world is changing, it's becoming darker, meaner, more violent. And while it's possible to choose neutrality in this tough new world, it has to be an active choice, one in which decisions are carefully made and steps taken to prepare for a potential attack. Because if recent events have shown us anything, it's that no nation can these days afford to be vulnerable. How to patch those vulnerabilities is a choice only Ireland's citizens can make.